I sat in the dark, watching the phone ring. I knew it was my son calling from a federal holding cell, begging me to bail him out. He thought I was his safety net. He didn't know that I had been watching from the shadows when the FBI raided his party. I could have warned him. I could have stopped it. Instead, I poured myself a drink and let it ring. But to understand why a father would watch his son's life burn to the ground and do nothing, we have to go back to the moment I saw the black sedan parked outside his glass castle. The coffee tasted like battery acid and old regrets. I drank it anyway, standing at the kitchen window, watching the gray light of Christmas morning bleed through the frost on the glass. It was 6 in the morning, the hour of the wolf, the hour when the house settled into its foundations and groaned under the weight of its own history. My hand, spotted with the liver marks of 70 years and the white scars of a life spent digging through other people's lies, held the mug steady. There was no tremor. There never was. The tremor was for men who didn't know how to brace for the impact, men who hadn't spent 40 years staring at balance sheets that bled red ink and crime scenes that smelled of copper and bleach. I turned my back on the window. The kitchen was clean, too clean, the kind of sterile cleanliness that comes when no one is living in a space, merely occupying it. A crumb on the counter would have been a relief. A stain would have been proof of life. I walked into the living room. It was a mausoleum. The air was cold, still, and smelled of lemon polish and dust. My eyes went automatically to the corner by the bay window. For 30 years, that corner had been a riot of green and gold every December. Elena used to handle the tree. She treated it like an architectural project. Lights first, tucked deep into the spine of the fir, then the heavy bulbs, then the fragile glass birds she'd inherited from her grandmother. She built it layer by layer, a fortress of light against the winter dark. Now, the corner was empty. Without the tree, the floor revealed a ghost. There was a patch of hardwood there, shaped like a jagged hexagon, slightly lighter than the surrounding oak. It was where the sun hadn't touched the floorboards for decades of winters. That pale scar on the wood screamed louder than any weeping widow. It was a geographical marker of absence. I sat in my armchair, the leather cold against my back. The silence in the house wasn't peaceful. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of a man resting after a long shift. It was heavy. It pressed against the eardrums. It was an accusation. I looked at the side table. There was a single object sitting there, wrapped in brown butcher paper and tied with a length of simple twine. The gift. I had bought it 3 months ago at an estate sale, in the chaotic, sprawling basement of a deceased surveyor. It was a compass. Not a plastic toy from a hiking shop, but a vintage Brunton pocket transit. Solid brass, heavy enough to break a toe if you dropped it. The needle floated in a bath of oil, immune to the shaking of hands, always seeking the magnetic truth of the North. It was a tool for finding your way when the landmarks were gone, when the map didn't match the terrain. I had imagined giving it to Leo. I had played the scene out in my head, a strategic simulation. I would hand it to him, heavy and cold. He would take it. He would feel the weight of it. Maybe he would understand that you can't navigate a storm with an app. You need mechanics. You need physics. But the compass sat there, gathering dust. I closed my eyes and replayed the phone call from yesterday. I didn't need a recording. My memory is a steel trap, etched with the precise intonation of every lie I've ever been told. "Dad," Leo had said. I could hear the background noise on his end, the clink of crystal, the low hum of expensive engines, the performative laughter of people who negotiate for a living. It's a networking thing this year. The partners, potential investors. It's going to be dry, boring, corporate strategy talk. You'd be miserable. His voice was polished, slippery. It had that sheen of management training, the kind of voice that uses empathy as a weapon to manage a liability. He spoke to me with the gentle, terrifying condescension one reserves for a toddler who needs a nap or a dog that needs to be put outside.
"I understand," I had said. My voice was flat, a dial tone. "We'll do something in January," he had promised. "When the dust settles, when the quarter closes. Win-win, right?" Win-win. The phrase tasted like ash. It was the language of the hustle. There is no such thing as a win-win in the real world. In my world, the world of forensic audits, of RICO statutes, of hidden offshore accounts, there is a winner and there is a loser. There is the man who catches the thief, and there is the thief. Leo had forgotten the foundational math. I opened my eyes. The dust motes were dancing in a shaft of weak sunlight that had managed to pierce the gloom. They swirled in chaotic patterns, governed by thermal currents I couldn't see but knew were there. Leo didn't exclude me because he thought I'd be bored. That was the surface lie, the paint over the rust. He excluded me because I am a structural risk. He knows what I used to do. He knows I spent a lifetime looking at numbers until they confessed. He knows I can look at a man's shoes and know if he's solvent. He knows I can smell the desperation on a man who is leveraged 10-1. He didn't want me at his party because he didn't want to be audited. I reached out and touched the brass compass through the paper. The metal was freezing. My son was 40 years old. He wore Italian wool suits that were cut too tight, shimmering with a distinct synthetic ambition. He drove a car that cost more than this house. He spoke in buzzwords: disruption, leverage, paradigm shift. He thought he was swimming with dolphins in a warm blue ocean. I took a sip of the cold coffee. It bit the back of my throat. I knew better. I knew the ocean he was swimming in. I knew the smell of the water when the chum is in it. He wasn't swimming with dolphins. He was swimming with sharks. And he had convinced himself he was one of them because he'd bought the right fin to strap to his back. The clock on the mantel ticked. Tick, tick, tick. A slow, rhythmic countdown. Elena would have made excuses for him. She would have said, "He's busy, Henry. He's building a life." She was the soft mortar that held the bricks together. I was just the stone. Without her, the wall was brittle. I stood up, the joints in my knees popping like dry twigs. The house felt too big. It felt like a fortress that had been abandoned by the garrison, leaving only the old watchman to pace the ramparts. I walked to the window again. The snow had started to fall, light flakes dusting the dead grass of the lawn. It was covering the cracks in the pavement, smoothing over the imperfections of the neighborhood. It was a cosmetic fix. Underneath, the concrete was still broken. I looked at the reflection of my own face in the glass. Gray stubble, eyes that had seen too much small print evil, a mouth set in a permanent line of grim assessment.
"Merry Christmas," I whispered to the empty room. The words fell dead in the air, absorbed by the drapes, by the carpet, by the lighter patch of wood where the tree should have been. I looked back at the compass. Leo was lost. He was drifting in open water without a landmark in sight, and he was so drunk on his own perceived altitude that he didn't even know he was drowning. And here I sat, the watchman, the auditor, the father. The silence grew louder. It wasn't just an absence of noise anymore. It was a physical pressure pushing against my chest. It demanded action. It demanded that I stop being a piece of furniture in my own life. I wasn't going to sit here and watch the dust settle. I wasn't going to wait for January, for the win-win, for the scraps of time he would toss me like gristle from his table. I turned away from the window. The coffee was finished. The caffeine was starting to hit the bloodstream, a dull thrum of alertness waking up the old machinery. I didn't need a party. I didn't need a tree. I needed to see the books.
The afternoon sun moved across the floorboards like the slow hand of a clock, marking time in inches of dust. I sat in the wingback chair, the leather warming beneath me, but I wasn't sleeping. Old men nod off. I was working. In the silence of the empty house, I opened the mental archives. My mind has always been a filing cabinet. Even in retirement, I organized the world into debits and credits, assets and liabilities. You don't spend 40 years hunting economic parasites without developing a taxonomy of decay. I can look at a balance sheet and see the exact moment a CEO decided to buy a mistress instead of funding the pension plan. I can look at a man's eyes and see the compounding interest of a lie. I pulled the file marked Leo. It wasn't a physical folder. Those were locked away in the fireproof safe in the basement. But the dossier in my head was more detailed. I flipped back 3 years, the timestamp of the infection. That was the year Leo stopped coming by for Sunday dinners to eat Elena's pot roast and started penciling us in for brunch at places where the eggs were served runny and the coffee cost $6. It was the year he joined Argos Capital. I remember the day he told me. He stood in this very living room, blocking the light from the window. He was wearing a new suit. That was the first red flag. Before Argos, Leo wore off-the-rack blends, sensible, durable, but this thing he had on, it was Italian wool, a Super 150s weave that caught the light with a damped synthetic sheen. It was cut too tight in the shoulders, too tapered at the ankle. It was a suit designed for standing in a showroom, not for sitting at a desk and doing the work. It restricted movement. It was vanity stitched into fabric.
"It's private equity, Dad," he had said, his voice vibrating with a frequency I hadn't heard before, a frantic, breathless enthusiasm. "We're not just buying companies, we're disrupting verticals. We're leveraging distressed assets to unlock value." Leverage, disrupt, unlock. I sat there, listening to my son speak in tongues. He was using the liturgy of the high-stakes gambler, but he thought he was reciting scripture. "What's the underlying asset, Leo?" I had asked. "What are you actually selling?" He had waved a hand, dismissing the question as if it were a fly buzzing around his head. "It's not about the product, Dad. That's old-school thinking. It's about the flow, the arbitrage opportunities between the valuation and the market cap." I remember the taste of the coffee I was drinking then. It turned sour. He had stopped asking for advice that day. Before, he would ask me about municipal bonds, about fixed-rate mortgages, about the safety of a credit union versus a bank. He used to respect the slow, unglamorous accumulation of wealth. He understood that a brick wall is built one stone at a time. But Argos Capital had taught him that you could print bricks out of thin air if you had enough confidence. I shifted in my chair, the leather creaking. I replayed the last 3 years and fast forward. The car came next, a Porsche Cayenne, a tank made of sports car parts. He drove it like he was angry at the road. Then the watch, a Hublot that looked like a manhole cover on his wrist, gaudy, loud, a watch that screamed, "Look at how much time costs me." He started talking about the guys at the firm, the partners. He mentioned names like the director or the architect, nicknames that sounded like comic book villains but were likely just sociopaths with MBAs. He told me about the retreats to Aspen and the dinners in private rooms where the wine list didn't have prices. He thought he was being inducted into a brotherhood of titans. I closed my eyes and breathed in the stale air of the living room. It smelled of lemon polish, but my memory summoned a different scent. The precinct, the economic crimes division. It had a specific smell. It was a cocktail of cheap, burnt coffee, ozone from the overheating Xerox machines, and the metallic tang of fear. Not the adrenaline fear of the homicide desk, where the blood was fresh. This was the cold, sweating fear of men who knew the math had finally caught up with them. I knew what money smelled like when it was rotting. Fresh money, honest money, has no smell. It's clean, it flows like water. But dirty money, leveraged money, money that exists only on a spreadsheet to hide a hole in the ground, that smells. It smells like sulfur. It smells like swamp gas bubbling up through the floorboards. I had smelled it on Leo the last time I saw him, 2 weeks ago. He had come by to drop off a box of pears, a corporate gift he clearly didn't want. He was vibrating. His knee bounced when he sat. His eyes were darting around the room, not landing on anything, scanning for threats that weren't there. "We're close to closing the fund," he had said, wiping sweat from his upper lip, though the house was drafty. "Once the Asian markets open on the new quarter, the liquidity injection will stabilize the cap table. It's going to be huge, Dad. Generational wealth." Liquidity injection. That's the phrase they use when the patient is bleeding out. I had looked at his hands. They were manicured, soft. The hands of a man who types, who signs, who shakes other soft hands. But the cuticles were chewed raw. "Leo," I had said softly, "are you in trouble?" He had laughed, a sharp barking sound that had no humor in it. "Trouble? Dad, I'm about to buy a boat. I'm looking at property in the Caymans. Trouble is for people who punch a clock."
He was insulted. He thought I was questioning his manhood. I wasn't. I was questioning his solvency. I opened my eyes and looked at the patch of light on the floor. It had moved 2 feet. The afternoon was dying. Leo didn't understand the ecosystem he was in. He thought he was a predator because he was swimming with them. He looked at the men around him, the silver-haired partners, the guys with the dead eyes and the perfect teeth, and he saw mentors. He saw a pod of dolphins frolicking in the surf, inviting him to play. He didn't see the teeth. In every scheme, in every long con, there is a face. The face is the one they put on the brochure. The face is the one who signs the documents because the real architects are too smart to put their names on anything that might be subpoenaed. The face is the one who believes the lie so fervently that he can sell it to his own grandmother. Leo was the face. They had dressed him up in Italian wool. They had let him buy the big house and the fast car. They had let him feel like a king, but they hadn't given him the keys to the kingdom. They had given him the codes to the fall.
I felt a phantom pain in my knuckles, the ghost of 1,000 fists clenched in frustration. He was chum, bloody, chopped-up bait thrown into the water to distract the regulators while the big fish swam for deep water. The realization settled in my gut, heavy and cold, like a stone swallowed whole. I stood up. The movement was stiff, mechanical. The files in my head snapped shut. The audit was complete. The conclusion was undeniable. My son wasn't just busy. He wasn't just arrogant. He was the designated corpse. I walked to the window. The sun was gone. The streetlights were flickering on, casting long orange shadows across the snow. The world outside was freezing, locking down for the night. But inside me, the temperature was rising. It wasn't anger. It was the low, steady burn of the engine turning over. I checked my watch. 4:15 p.m. The silence was no longer an accusation. It was a countdown. I turned away from the window and walked toward the hall closet. I didn't need to think about what to do next. The analysis phase was over. It was time to go on patrol.
The itch started in the marrow of my left shin, right where a perp had kicked me with a steel-toed boot back in '98 during a warehouse raids. It wasn't pain, it was a frequency, a low-level hum that traveled up the skeletal structure and settled at the base of my skull. I knew this sensation. I hadn't felt it in 10 years, not since I handed in my badge and my piece, but the body doesn't forget. It was the biological warning system of an old predator sensing a shift in the wind. It was the feeling you get when the numbers on the page balance perfectly, but the ink smells wrong. I couldn't sit in the chair anymore. The silence of the house, which had been merely heavy an hour ago, was now suffocating. It felt like the air was being pumped out of the room. I walked to the hall closet. The door stuck slightly, the wood swollen from the damp winter. I yanked it open. There it was. The greatcoat, charcoal wool, heavy enough to smother a small fire, stiff with age. I pulled it off the hanger. It released a puff of scent, a distinct, nostalgic cocktail of naphthalene mothballs and the ghosts of pipe tobacco. I haven't smoked a pipe in 15 years, but the wool held on to the memory better than I did. I put it on. The weight of it settled on my shoulders like a yoke. It was a familiar burden. It restricted my movement just enough to make me mindful of every step. It was armor. When I buttoned it up to the chin, I felt the persona shift. The retired widower, the man who worried about the heating bill and the color of the hardwood, receded. In his place stood the man who used to stare down embezzlers until they wept.
"Just turning the engine over," I said aloud. My voice sounded raspy in the empty hall. "Battery will die in this cold if I don't run it." It was a lie, a necessary administrative fiction. I needed a reason to open the garage door that didn't sound like madness. I walked out to the detached garage. The air outside was biting, sharp as broken glass. The snow was falling in earnest now, fat, wet flakes that clung to the eyelashes. The Buick was waiting, a '96 Roadmaster, maroon, with an engine block of cast iron and a suspension designed to float over potholes. It was a relic, a land yacht from an era when cars were built like bank vaults. Leo had told me a dozen times to trade it in for something with sensors and cameras. "It's a death trap, Dad," he'd said. He was wrong. It was a tank. And unlike his fiberglass toys, if I hit something in this, I'd walk away. I slid behind the wheel. The leather was freezing, stiff as cardboard. I pumped the gas pedal twice, mechanical priming, not digital fuel injection, and turned the key. The V8 roared to life, a deep, guttural cough that settled into a rhythmic, menacing idle. The vibration traveled up through the steering column and into my hands. It felt like shaking hands with an old friend who knew where the bodies were buried. I didn't wait for the heat. I backed out into the alley. The neighborhood was dark. The brick bungalows of my block were huddled together against the cold, their windows glowing with the warm yellow light of modest Christmases.
These were houses built by men who worked with their hands: plumbers, electricians, transit workers. The mortgages were paid, the cars and the driveways were domestic and 5 years old. It was the sector of the solvent. I drove. The car knew the way. I didn't have to think about the turns. My hands executed the maneuvers on autopilot. I headed north, away from the grid of sensible streets, towards the elevation. The city changed as I climbed. The streetlights shifted from the amber sodium glow of the working class to the harsh clinical white of the LED arrays in the tax bracket hills. The houses pulled away from the street, retreating behind iron gates and manicured hedges that were now drowning in white. Here, the driveways didn't just lead to garages, they had names. Highland Rise, Summit View, the Enclave. The snow was coming down harder, a white curtain dropping over the stage. The windshield wipers slapped back and forth, a metronome counting down to something I couldn't yet see. The snow was doing its job, erasing the grime, covering the oil slicks, smoothing over the cracks in the asphalt. It was whitewashing the city. I watched the road. My eyes scanned the periphery. I wasn't looking for traffic. There was none. I was looking for anomalies. A parked car with its lights off, a set of tracks that didn't make sense. I passed the sign for Ridgewood Heights. This was Leo's territory.
The transition was physical. My jaw tightened. The taste of copper returned to my mouth. I wasn't going to visit my son. That was the fiction. I was going to inspect a liability. Leo thought he had ascended. He thought that by moving up here, to these glass and steel temples that looked like Apple stores dropped into a forest, he had escaped the gravity of his background. But gravity is a constant. You can't leverage your way out of physics. The Buick labored slightly as the incline steepened. I kept the speed steady. 25 mph, patrol speed, fast enough to get somewhere, slow enough to see everything. I thought about the men Leo was with tonight, the investors. I had spent a career hunting men like that. They weren't builders, they were termites. They ate the structure from the inside out, leaving a hollow shell that looked perfect until you leaned on it. And when the collapse came, they were always the first ones out the window, parachutes made of golden silk billowing behind them. Leo didn't have a parachute. He was part of the structure they were eating. I crested the hill. The city spread out below me, a grid of lights obscured by the storm. But I wasn't looking down. I was looking ahead. I turned off the radio. I needed total sensory focus. The hum of the tires on the snow-packed road was the only sound. I was no longer Henry, the father who had bought a brass compass and sat in a silent house. I had compartmentalized him. He was locked in the trunk. I was the auditor. I was the man who arrives when the party is over to count the spoons.
The road narrowed, winding between high stone walls. I checked my mirrors. Empty. Just the swirling vortex of white in the red glow of my taillights. I was approaching the target. I slowed the car, letting the engine drop to a low growl. My eyes narrowed, cutting through the glare of the snow. I wasn't just driving. I was stalking. And then, through the trees, I saw the glow.
I killed the engine 2 blocks east of the target. I didn't pull up to the gate. I didn't announce my arrival. That's an amateur move, a mistake made by men who want to be greeted. I parked the Buick in the blind spot of a massive weeping willow that hung over the curb, its bare branches scraping the roof like skeletal fingers. It was force of habit. In the old days, you never parked directly in front of the location you were surveilling. You parked where you could see the exit, but the exit couldn't see you. You left yourself an avenue of retreat and a wide angle of observation. I checked the street. Empty. The snow was piling up on the hood of the car within seconds, a natural camouflage. I stepped out. The cold hit me like a physical blow, a wet, heavy slap against the face. I buttoned the greatcoat to the throat and pulled my cap down low. My boots crunched into the fresh powder. It was the only sound in the world, distinct and sharp, until the wind shifted. Then I heard it. It was a low, rhythmic thumping. Thud, thud, thud. It vibrated in the soles of my feet before it registered in my ears. It was the bass from the house, a synthesized heartbeat pumping through the neighborhood, indifferent to the silence of the holy night. It was the sound of excess. I walked the 2 blocks. I stayed close to the hedge line, moving through the shadows. The houses here were set back,
dark fortresses of stone and timber, their occupants likely wintering in Aspen or St. Bart's. But Leo's house was awake. I rounded the final corner and stopped. It was a monstrosity.
The architect had clearly hated the concept of walls. The structure was a jagged assembly of steel beams and floor-to-ceiling glass, jutting out from the hillside like a crystalline growth. In the dark, surrounded by the swirling snow, it glowed like a reactor core on the verge of a meltdown. It didn't cast warm, inviting light. It radiated a harsh, clinical halogen brilliance that bleached the color out of the surrounding trees. It wasn't a home. A home is a place where you seek shelter. This was a stage. It was designed to be looked at, not lived in. It was a fishbowl where the inhabitants performed for an audience they pretended to ignore. I moved closer, keeping to the tree line across the street. The driveway was a parking lot for the leveraged elite. It was packed tight, a mosaic of metal and ego. I scanned the inventory. 3 Bentley Bentagas looking like black hearses on steroids, 2 Mercedes G-Wagons, boxy, military-grade vehicles that had never seen a dirt road in their lives, their paint jobs pristine, their tires shined with silicone. A Range Rover with diplomatic plates. And there, right in the center, blocking the flow, was a Ferrari. I stared at it. It was low, red, and angry. It sat in the snow like a drop of fresh blood on a hospital sheet. I felt a surge of genuine second-hand embarrassment. Driving a rear-wheel drive supercar with summer tires to a house in the hills during a blizzard wasn't a flex, it was a confession. It screamed a lack of foresight. It screamed that the owner didn't understand the environment he was operating in. He thought the laws of physics would suspend themselves because of the badge on his hood.
The car was already covered in a thin layer of white. By midnight, it would be buried. The owner would need a tow truck to get it out. I shook my head. Assets, Leo would call them. Liabilities, I corrected. Every single one of them was a depreciation engine, burning cash to signal status to people who were doing the exact same thing. It was a circle jerk of insolvency. I moved to a gap in the neighbor's hedge. From here, I had a clear line of sight into the great room. The glass walls offered zero privacy, which was the point. I watched the shadows play against the light. There were perhaps 30 people inside. The men were carbon copies of the suit Leo wore, slim fit, dark, aggressive. They moved with a jerky, chemically enhanced energy. They gathered in clusters, gesturing wildly with their hands, physically carving out space in the air. The women were decorative, standing still, holding flutes of champagne like props. They shimmered in sequins and silk, shivering slightly every time a door opened, suffering for the aesthetic. I saw a waiter move through the crowd with a silver tray. He was invisible to them. They took glasses without looking at him, without pausing their conversations. The bass thumped harder, rattling the window pane of the neighbor's garden shed next to me. It was a hollow sound. There was no melody, no structure, just force.
I focused on the center of the room. It was a display of power, or rather, what children think power looks like. Children think power is noise. They think it's bright lights and fast cars and music that shakes the floor. They think it's being the center of attention. I have seen real power. Real power is a quiet room. Real power is a man in a gray cardigan sitting at a scratched wooden desk who can sign a piece of paper that shuts down a factory or freezes an account. Real power doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need a Ferrari in the snow. It doesn't need to prove it exists. This was fear, dressed up as a party. They were loud because they were terrified of the silence. They turned the lights up to banish the shadows where the consequences lived. They bought the G-Wagons to feel armored against a world that was slowly, inevitably, realizing they produced nothing of value. I watched a man raise a glass. The room toasted. Mouths opened in a collective cheer I couldn't hear through the glass. It looked like a silent scream. My eyes swept the perimeter of the property. The security lights were blazing, cutting cones of visibility into the storm, but they were pointed the wrong way. They were pointed out, towards the street, to dazzle the envy of the passers-by. They weren't watching the dark spots. They weren't watching the perimeter. Arrogance is a blindfold. I adjusted my collar against the wind. The snow was seeping into the wool of my coat, but I didn't brush it off.
I stood perfectly still, a statue in the darkness, watching the fish swim in their illuminated tank. "Enjoy the champagne," I whispered. The steam from my breath swirled in the cold air. The glass castle was magnificent, it was brilliant, and it was fragile. One well-placed stone, one structural shift, one sudden drop in temperature, and the whole thing would shatter. I looked away from the party and scanned the shadows beyond the light. If I was here, watching, I knew I wasn't the only one. The ecosystem always balances itself. Where there is a feast of unprotected meat, the wolves are never far behind. And tonight, the scent of meat was overwhelming. I reached into the deep pocket of my greatcoat. My hand closed around the cold, rubberized casing of the Bushnells. I keep them in the glove box, usually. Birdwatching, I tell the neighbors when they see them on the passenger seat. Looking for cardinals. It's a harmless hobby for a retiree. It suggests a gentle patience, a love for nature. It disarms people. But tonight I wasn't looking for cardinals. I was looking for vultures. I raised the lenses to my eyes. The glass was high quality, nitrogen-purged, fog-proof. I adjusted the focus wheel with a thumb that had lost its feeling to the cold minutes ago. The blur of light and color sharpened into terrifying clarity. The distance collapsed. Suddenly, I wasn't across the street in the snow. I was in the room with them. I swept the sector, left to right. The interior of the house was an aquarium of high-definition greed. The lighting was recessed, expensive, designed to make skin look tan and jewelry look brilliant. I found Leo immediately. He was standing near the fireplace, a gas insert, of course, featuring polished stones instead of wood. No mess, no ash, just a sterile blue-orange flame that required no tending. He was laughing. It was a performance. I saw the way his head went back, exposing the throat. I saw the way his mouth opened too wide, showing too many teeth. He was holding a tumbler of amber liquid, something single malt, peaty, old enough to vote, and he was sloshing it slightly as he gestured. He looked ecstatic. He looked like a man who had just won the lottery and was inviting everyone to touch the ticket. To the casual observer, he looked like the life of the party. To me, he looked like a man standing on a trap door. I shifted the focus slightly to the men surrounding my son. In my line of work, you learn that criminals come in species. There are the desperate ones, the addicts and the debtors who vibrate with anxiety. There are the bullies who use size and volume to intimidate. And then there are the ones in that room. I examined the circle around my son. 3 men. They weren't laughing. They were smiling. There is a difference. A laugh involves the eyes. A smile like theirs stops at the nose. They were still. Too still. While Leo bounced on the balls of his feet, burning energy, these men were conserving it. They stood with their weight back, hips aligned, drinks held at chest level but rarely sipped. I focused on their eyes. Even through the lenses, across 50 yards of snowy night, I could see the emptiness. They were dead eyes, flat, opaque, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. They were the eyes of men who had calculated the cost of a human soul and decided it was a rounding error. These weren't investors. Investors ask questions. Investors look at the exits. Investors check their watches. These were predators. They were waiting for the meat to tenderize. My gaze locked on the alpha. He was standing slightly to Leo's right, a man in his 60s perhaps, silver hair, perfectly coiffed, swept back like a lion's mane. He wore a suit that I recognized, a bespoke charcoal pinstripe, likely Savile Row. The fabric draped over him like liquid steel. It was a suit that cost more than my annual pension. It was a suit that didn't just cover the body, it announced a tax bracket. He wasn't drinking. He was holding a glass of mineral water with a slice of lime. He was on the clock. I watched him watch Leo. He looked at my son with a mixture of amusement and contempt. It was the way a biologist looks at a lab rat running a maze, noting the speed, the eagerness, the stupidity. Then the silver-haired man moved. He reached out a hand. It was manicured, a heavy signet ring on the pinky finger flashing under the recessed lights. He placed it on Leo's shoulder. I zoomed in. The grip wasn't light, it was firm. He squeezed the trapezius muscle, his thumb pressing into the fabric of Leo's jacket. To the room, it looked like affection. It looked like a mentor proud of his protege. "Good job, kid.
You're one of us now. I lowered the binoculars for a second, feeling the bile rise in my throat. It wasn't affection. It was possession. It was the farmer checking the density of the livestock before the slaughter. It was the tactile confirmation of ownership. He was feeling the quality of the suit he was about to strip off the carcass. He was anchoring Leo in place, ensuring he didn't drift away before the check cleared or the subpoena dropped. I raised the glasses again. Leo didn't recoil. He didn't flinch. He preened. He actually leaned into the touch. His shoulders dropped. He looked at the silver-haired man with a gaze so full of desperate gratitude it made my stomach turn. He was drinking in the validation like it was oxygen. He thought he was being knighted. "You fool," I thought, the words echoing in the silence of the snowy street. "You blind, stupid fool." He was deaf to the frequency of danger. I had raised him to be honest. I had raised him to do the math, but somewhere along the line he had decided that math was boring and that magic was real. He had decided that if he just wore the right costume and stood next to the right people, the laws of consequence wouldn't apply to him.
The silver-haired man leaned in and whispered something in Leo's ear. Leo laughed again, a sharp, barking sound that I could see but not hear. He raised his glass to the room. The sharks in the tank didn't raise theirs. They just watched him. They knew something he didn't. They knew the timeline. They knew the exit strategy. And they knew who was going to be left holding the bag when the lights went out. Leo was the insulation. He was the blast shield. They were going to use his signature, his face, his desperate need for approval to absorb the impact of whatever was coming. I lowered the binoculars slowly. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the suppression of a violent instinct. I wanted to smash through that glass. I wanted to drag him out by his collar. I wanted to punch the silver-haired man in his perfect teeth. But I stayed in the shadows, because I saw something else. As the silver-haired man withdrew his hand, he didn't look at Leo. He looked past him. He looked toward the window. He looked out into the dark, scanning the perimeter.
He checked his watch. It wasn't a casual glance. It was a synchronization check. The timeline was advancing. The party wasn't the event. The party was the waiting room. I felt a sudden shift in the wind. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, not from the chill, but from the proximity of the threat. I wasn't the only one watching this house. I turned away from the lit stage of the window and swept the binoculars down the street, away from the glare, into the darkness of the surrounding neighborhood. The sharks were inside, but the exterminators were outside, and they were already here.
I lowered the binoculars, letting them hang against the damp wool of my coat. My eyes burned, not from the cold, but from the glare of the glass castle. The afterimage of the party, the gold light, the red Ferrari, the silver hair, floated in my vision like sunspots. But you don't survive in my line of work by focusing on the light. You survive by watching the shadows. I turned my back on Leo's house. I forced my breathing to slow, exhaling a long, thin stream of vapor that disappeared instantly into the wind. I needed to reset the baseline. I needed to see the street as it was, not as the partygoers imagined it. I raised the glasses again. This time, I didn't look for faces. I looked for geometry. I looked for things that broke the pattern of a quiet, wealthy suburb on Christmas night. Sector scan. Left to right. Low sweep. The snow was doing its work. It was a pristine blanket, smoothing over the curbs and the manicured lawns. There were no tire tracks on the road surface yet. The plow hadn't come through in an hour. The stillness was almost absolute. Almost. 50 yards down from Leo's gate, parked in the dark recess between two streetlights, was a shape that didn't belong.
It was a gray utility van, indistinct, boxy. The kind of vehicle your eyes slide over because it's designed to be invisible. It had the generic livery of City Water and Power on the side panel, a magnetic decal if I had to guess, slightly askew. I adjusted the focus wheel. The image sharpened. My brain started running the checklist, the anomaly detection protocol. Fact 1. Context. It is December 25th, Christmas night. The city is hemorrhaging money. The municipal budget was slashed 3 months ago. I read the minutes of the council meetings because I still track the flow of public funds. They don't authorize overtime for anything less than a catastrophic main break or a downed power line. If there was a leak, there would be yellow strobe lights, there would be cones, there would be 2 guys standing around a hole smoking cigarettes while a 3rd guy dug. There was no hole. There were no cones. There was just the van, sitting in the dark, like a tombstone.
I felt the old instinct lock into place. It was the feeling of tumblers falling in a safe. Click, click, click. This wasn't a repair crew. This was a listening post. I held my breath and leaned against the rough bark of the willow tree to steady my hands. I needed one more detail, one confirmation. I waited. Surveillance is 99% boredom and 1% adrenaline. You have to wait for the target to make a mistake. You have to wait for the shift change or the sneeze or the scratch of a nose. 2 minutes passed. The snow piled on my shoulders. Then, movement. Inside the cab of the van, a shadow shifted. It was subtle, just a slight adjustment of posture in the passenger seat. And then, I saw it. A faint, spectral glow illuminated the interior. It wasn't the warm yellow of a cabin light or the harsh white of a flashlight. It was the cold, sickly blue of an LED monitor. It reflected off a pair of wire-rimmed glasses.
The face was obscured, but the reflection told the whole story. The light was steady. It was text scrolling on a screen. It was the distinct, high-contrast palette of government-issue surveillance software. I knew that color. I had spent years staring at it in cramped vans just like that one, smelling stale donuts and body odor while we waited for a wiretap to pay off. That blue glow is the color of a warrant. I lowered the binoculars slowly. The cold metal casing bit into my palm. The logic was complete. The equation was balanced. The silver-haired man inside the house wasn't just checking his watch because he was bored. He was checking the timeline. He was coordinating. This was a sting. I looked back at the house. It looked different now. Before, it had looked like a fortress of arrogance. Now, it looked like a cage. The glass walls weren't there to let the light out. They were there to let the snipers see in. Leo was in the kill box. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of nausea. Not for the crime. If Leo had crossed the line, he deserved the fall. I believe in the law. I believe in the ledger. But the sheer scale of this. Local cops don't use vans with that kind of battery tech. Local cops don't sit in the dark on Christmas Day for a white-collar pinch. They knock on the door the next morning. This was federal. This was the alphabet soup agencies. They had been building this case for months, maybe years. They had let Argos Capital run up the score. They had let them inflate the bubble until it was ready to burst, ensuring the splash damage would be maximized. They wanted a spectacle. They wanted the perp walk on the 10 p.m. news. And my son was the guest of honor. I looked at the van again. The blue light flickered, a screen refresh, and then vanished as the occupant turned away. They were just waiting for the signal. The blue light city water and power van was the anvil, but an anvil needs a hammer. I turned my head further down the street, scanning the deeper shadows, the places where the streetlights didn't reach. The van was the technical support. The takedown team would be separate. They would be close, they would be heavy. My eyes adjusted to the gloom of the retaining wall at the end of the block. And there it was. The logic of the street was absolute. If the van was the ears, there had to be teeth. I shifted my stance, the snow crunching softly under my boots, a sound too loud in the stillness of my own anxiety. I moved my gaze past the utility van, pushing deeper into the darkness where the street curved behind a retaining wall of rough-hewn granite. It was a blind spot, the kind of architectural afterthought where teenagers went to smoke and where lovers parked to hide. Tonight, it was occupied by something much heavier. I saw the nose of the car first. It was protruding just inches beyond the shadow of the wall, catching a stray glint from a street lamp 50 feet away. Matte black, absorbing the light, not reflecting it. I adjusted the focus on the Bushnells one last time. My hands were stiff, the knuckles white and aching, but the image in the glass was sharp enough to cut. It was a sedan. A Dodge Charger, heavy-duty package. The kind with the upgraded suspension that sits an inch higher than the civilian models. The kind with the push-bar mounts hidden behind the grille. It was tucked into the shadow like a roach in a crack, silent, idling without lights. I scanned the silhouette. To the untrained eye, it was just a car, maybe a private security detail for one of the high rollers inside. But I saw the tell. On the trunk lid, just off-center, was a small black plastic puck, and next to it, a thin, whip-like antenna that vanished into the dark air.
The puck was a GPS cellular uplink for a mobile data terminal. The whip was for encrypted radio traffic on the federal bands. You don't buy those at an auto parts store. You don't get those on a lease. I moved the binoculars down to the bumper. The license plate was obscured by road salt and shadow, but I knew the typography. I knew the spacing. I waited for a car to pass on the cross street, praying for a sweep of headlights. A moment later, a delivery truck rumbled by 2 blocks away. The beam swept across the darkness. For a fraction of a second, the plate illuminated. U.S. Government, G14, the code for General Services Administration, Federal Fleet. The air in my lungs turned to ice. It wasn't the local PD, it wasn't the state police, this wasn't a noise complaint or a zoning violation. This was the Bureau, or the SEC Enforcement Division with Marshal backup, or the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. The specific agency didn't matter, the weight of it did. When the feds show up in a sedan like that, on a holiday, at this hour, they aren't coming to ask questions, they are coming to execute. This wasn't a hunch, this was a raid.
I lowered the binoculars. The strap dug into my neck. My stomach turned over, a slow, sickening revolution, like a heavy stone tumbling in deep water. It was a physical sensation I hadn't felt since I stood in a morgue 20 years ago and identified a CI who I'd failed to protect. It was the cold, hard knot of total, irreversible failure. I looked back at the glass house. It glowed with an obscene, golden warmth. I could still see the silhouettes of the party guests. I could see Leo's arm raised in a toast. They had no idea. The cruelty of the timing was precise. It was calculated. I recognized the strategy because I had used it myself, in a smaller life, for smaller crimes. They were waiting for peak capacity. If they hit the house at 6 p.m., they might miss the key players. If they hit it tomorrow morning, the evidence might be shredded. But now everyone was there. The partners, the investors, the marks. The evidence was in the room, likely being bragged about. They wanted the spectacle. Federal prosecutors are political animals. They don't just want a conviction, they want a press release. They want the visual. They want to march the financial wizards out of their glass castle in handcuffs, parading them past the Bentleys and the Ferraris that were purchased with stolen money. They want the neighbors to see. They want the footage for the morning news cycle. It is psychological warfare. It destroys the reputation before the trial even begins. It strips the target of their dignity, their armor, their social standing in a single flashing moment of blue and red lights. I looked at the black sedan again. It sat there with the patience of a reptile. They were here for the silver-haired man. I knew that. He was the architect. He was the one who built the maze. But they were also here for his accomplice. Accomplice. The word tasted like copper pennies in my mouth. It was a legal term, dry and sharp. It stripped away the relationship. It stripped away son, boy, child. It replaced them with a status in a criminal complaint. Leo wasn't just a fool. In the eyes of the men in that sedan, he was a co-conspirator. He was a signatory. He was the man who opened the door and let the vampires in. I leaned back against the rough bark of the willow tree, feeling the age in my legs. I closed my eyes for a second, and I saw the future. I saw it as clearly as if I were watching a rerun of an old case. I saw the breach team move up the driveway. I saw the front door, that massive pivot-hinge slab of oak, splinter open. I saw the confusion turn to panic. I saw the champagne glasses shatter on the polished concrete floor. I saw Leo. I saw the look on his face when the reality of the world finally crashed through his delusion. The confusion, the denial, the terror. He would look for the silver-haired man to fix it, but the silver-haired man would already be lawyering up, cutting a deal, offering Leo up as the sacrificial lamb to save his own skin. Leo would be alone. He would be handcuffed, zip-tied probably because it's faster. They would lead him out into the snow. He wouldn't have his coat. He would be shivering in his tight Italian suit, the snowflakes melting on his expensive shirt, turning the fabric translucent. He would look at the cameras. He would look for a friend, and he would see no one. The silence of the street felt heavy now, charged with potential kinetic energy. The black sedan was the firing pin. The house was the primer. I was the only one who heard the hammer cocking. A wave of protective instinct surged through me, hot, irrational, violent. It was the father in me clawing his way out of the trunk where I had locked him. "Do something," the voice screamed. "He's your boy. He's an idiot, but he's your boy."
I could run. I could cross the 2 blocks in 3 minutes. I could pound on the door. I could throw a brick through the window of the Ferrari to draw the police early, to create a diversion, to give him 5 minutes of chaos to flush a hard drive or call a lawyer. My hand twitched. The keys to the Buick were in my pocket. I could drive down there. I could block the driveway. I stared at the black sedan. The men inside were professionals. They had guns. They had authority. They had the mandate of the state. But I had the element of surprise. I took a step away from the tree. The snow crunched. The decision hung in the air, suspended like the snowflakes caught in the streetlight's beam. I looked at the house one last time. I looked at Leo, still laughing, still holding court. He looked so happy. He looked so successful. The illusion was perfect, and it was about to die. I tightened my grip on the binoculars. The knot in my stomach tightened into a cramp. They were here for my son, and I was standing in the shadows, holding a ticket to the show. My hand found the chrome handle of the Roadmaster. It was freezing, a bar of dry ice that seared the skin of my palm even through the calluses. The pain grounded me. It was the only real thing in a world that was rapidly dissolving into potential calamities. The father in me was screaming. It wasn't a rational voice. It was a siren, a primal, red-alert klaxon that drowned out the wind and the bass and the silence of the snow. Run, it screamed. Move. Go. The tactical map in my head redrew itself instantly. I wasn't the auditor anymore. I was the fixer. I calculated the vectors. If I engaged the engine now, I could be at the front gate in 45 seconds. I wouldn't go in as a threat. I would go in as a liability. I would play the senile old man. I could see the play unfold with the precision of a chess opening. I would crash the Buick into the brick pillar of the gate, not enough to kill, just enough to crumple the fender and set off the horn. I would stumble out. I would clutch my chest. I would scream for my son. The agents in the black sedan and the van would have to react. Protocol dictates that preservation of life overrides the preservation of evidence. They would freeze. They would call the MS. The raid commander would curse. The timeline would fracture. And in the chaos, the focus would shift from the house to the street. It would give Leo 5 minutes. 5 minutes is an eternity in a financial crime. 5 minutes is enough to pull the hard drives. 5 minutes is enough to flush the thumb drives down the toilet. 5 minutes is enough to shred the letter of intent sitting on the desk. I could walk into that room babbling about my heart, about the cold, about where I was. I could grab Leo, shake him, whisper the code word in his ear while I pretended to weep on his shoulder. Burn it. Burn it all. I could take the bullet for him. I had done it before. The memory files opened unbidden. Not the financial records this time, but the emotional ledger, the red ink of fatherhood. I remembered the call from the dean of students when Leo was 19. Plagiarism, expulsion on the table. I had driven 3 hours in a sleet storm. I had sat in the office, hat in hand, and I had negotiated. I had paid the administrative fine. I had looked the dean in the eye and promised it was a misunderstanding, a lapse in judgment due to family stress. I lied for him. I bought his second chance. I remembered the fender bender when he was 24. He had been drinking, just a little, just enough to ruin him. I arrived before the cops. I put him in my passenger seat. I took the keys to his car. When the patrol car rolled up, I was the one standing by the dented bumper. I took the points on my license. I took the insurance hike. I hid the trembling boy from the harsh lights of the breathalyzer. I remembered the silent agreements with Elena. The times I hid the credit card bills. The times I fixed the mistakes before she could see the cracks in her perfect boy. "He's just finding his way, Henry," she would say, and I would nod, and I would write the check. I tightened my grip on the door handle. The metal bit into my flesh. I could feel the latch mechanism under my thumb ready to disengage. One click, that was all it took. One click to start the car, to start the lie, to save him one last time. I could claim he was incompetent. I could tell the feds he was just a figurehead, a stupid boy who didn't know a balance sheet from a menu. I could point the finger at the silver-haired man and say, "He used him. My son is an idiot, not a criminal." It would destroy his pride. It would destroy his reputation, but it would keep him out of a federal cage. My muscles coiled, ready to spring. The adrenaline was a hot, metallic taste in my mouth. I wanted to do it. God help me, I wanted to do it.
I wanted to rush into the fire and carry him out, just like I did when he was 5 and scraped his knee on the asphalt. I wanted to be the hero, but the hero doesn't teach the lesson. The hero just delays the pain. I looked at the house again. I looked at the silhouette of my son in the window, raising his glass, bathing in the admiration of wolves. He wasn't 5 anymore. He was 40, and the scrape on his knee wasn't from asphalt. It was from kneeling before false idols. The handle was freezing. My hand was shaking. "Open it," the father screamed. "Save him." "Wait," the auditor whispered. "Look at the cost."
I raised the Bushnells one last time. I needed to be sure. I needed to inspect the evidence before I closed the case file on my own flesh and blood. I zoomed in on Leo's face. He was standing on a cowhide rug, the center of the solar system, holding his glass up to the ceiling lights. The amber liquid caught the glare, shining like liquid gold. But I wasn't looking at the drink. I was looking at the jaw. It was set, rigid. There was a tightness there, a jutting projection of the chin that I recognized. It wasn't the tension of a man under duress. It was the tension of a man who believes he has conquered the world. The arrogance was etched into the bone structure. I lowered the glass slightly. I watched him clap the silver-haired man on the back. It was a familiar gesture, too familiar. It was the gesture of a co-conspirator. My hand was still on the door handle of the Buick, my thumb hovering over the button. The metal was biting into my skin, a freezing reminder of the reality outside. I had been lying to myself. I had told myself he was a victim. I had told myself he was a naive boy who got caught in a net woven by smarter men.
But looking at him now, preening in his Italian wool, I saw the truth. He wasn't a victim. He was a willing participant. He hadn't excluded me from this life because he was ashamed of my frayed cuffs or my old car. He hadn't kept me away because I would be bored by the networking. He kept me away because he was afraid of my eyes. He knew what I was. He knew I could look at a spreadsheet and see the cancer. He knew I could walk into a room and smell the rot behind the cologne. He knew that if I came to his parties, if I met his partners, I would ask the one question that destroys schemes like this. Where does the value come from? He didn't want a father. He wanted an audience. And I am a critic. I watched him laugh again. It was a rich, full-throated sound that carried the weight of unearned confidence. If I opened this door, if I drove down there and saved him, what would I be buying? I wouldn't be buying his freedom. I would be buying his validation.
If I pulled him out of the fire now, he wouldn't learn that fire burns. He would learn that he is fireproof. He would learn that no matter how deep he digs the hole, no matter how many people he defrauds, no matter how many lies he tells, the old wolf will always come down from the hills to scare away the hunters. He would become a better criminal, a more entitled one. I would be subsidizing his corruption. I would be an accessory after the fact, not legally, but morally. My thumb trembled on the latch. He is 40 years old. When I was 40, I had a mortgage, 2 kids, and ulcers from worrying about the electric bill. I stood on my own 2 feet. I took the hits. Leo wanted to be a titan. He used the word constantly. We're titans of industry, Dad. Titans don't get bailed out by their fathers in a rusted Buick. Titans stand in the ruin they created and they own it. Titans fall, and when they hit the ground, the earth shakes.
Gravity is the only honest judge left in the world, and gravity was coming for Leo. I looked at the black sedan. I looked at the utility van. I looked at the glass house. The equation balanced. The ledger was closed. The debt was due, and it was not mine to pay. I took a breath. It rattled in my chest, cold and sharp. I took my hand off the door handle. I moved my thumb. I pressed down on the lock pin. Click. In the silence of the winter night, it was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It sounded like a bone breaking. It sounded like a gavel coming down. I sat back in the seat. The leather groaned. I felt lighter, and yet infinitely heavier. I re-engaged the lock. The barrier was up. The fortress was sealed. I wasn't the fixer anymore. I was just a witness. My hand moved from the lock to the column shifter. The movement was heavy, deliberate. I pulled the lever down into drive. The transmission engaged with a subtle mechanical clunk that shook the chassis. It was the sound of a decision being finalized. I didn't turn on the headlights, not yet. I let the Buick roll forward, the tires crunching softly over the packed snow. I kept my foot off the gas, letting the idle speed carry me. I was a ghost ship slipping out of the harbor before the storm broke. I steered with one hand, my eyes flicking between the windshield and the rearview mirror. In the glass, the scene behind me shrank. The glowing reactor core of Leo's house, the jagged silhouette of the roofline, the ominous black shape of the federal sedan, it all compressed into a rectangular frame. I watched the sedan. I held my breath, waiting for the flare of headlights, the sudden lurch of pursuit. I waited for them to realize that the old man in the maroon car had seen too much, that he was part of the equation. But the sedan remained a stone. The van remained a shadow. They weren't looking at the street. Their eyes were fixed on the prize. They were focused on the man with the silver hair and the boy with the glass of scotch. They didn't care about a rusted American sedan drifting away in the dark. To them, I was just background noise, irrelevant.
I turned the corner, putting the bulk of a limestone retaining wall between me and the raid. Only then did I pull the knob for the headlights. The beams cut through the darkness, yellow and thick, illuminating a tunnel of swirling white. The snow was falling harder now. It was a curtain falling on the final act. I pressed the accelerator. The V8 responded, a low, steady growl that vibrated through the floorboards. I checked the mirror again. Nothing but white. The snow was erasing my tire tracks as fast as I made them. By morning, there would be no record that I had been there. There would be no physical evidence that the father had stood in the shadows and watched the son dance on the edge of the volcano. The witness was scrubbing the tape, but the internal tape was looping. I was leaving my son in a burning building. I knew the layout, I knew the accelerants, I knew exactly where the exits were blocked, and I was the only man within 10 miles who held a hose. I could have put out the fire, or at least I could have dampened it enough to get him out a window. I could have created the diversion that saved his skin, if not his soul.
The guilt hit me then. It wasn't a sharp pain, it was a dull, sickening weight in the gut. It tasted like copper pennies, that distinct metallic tang of blood and adrenaline that comes when you betray your own biology. It tasted like failure. "You're abandoning him," the voice whispered. "You're leaving him to the wolves." I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned the color of parchment. "No," I said aloud. The word was flat, swallowed by the hum of the heater. I wasn't abandoning him. I was respecting his agency. Leo had spent 40 years trying to build a world where he didn't need me. He had spent the last decade constructing a fortress of yes-men, of accolades, of expensive barriers to keep out the ugly realities of the world I lived in. He wanted to be a king. He wanted the glass castle. Well, he had it. He had the castle, he had the court, and now he had the siege. If I turned back now, if I saved him, I would be stealing the only thing he had left. The consequences. A man is defined by how he stands in the storm. If I built a shelter over him every time it rained, he would never know if he was waterproof. He would just be damped and resentful. The resolve hardened in my chest. It felt like steel cooling in a mold, rigid, unbending, permanent. I drove down the hill, descending from the heights of the Ridgewood enclave back to the grid of the city. The houses became smaller, closer together. The fences changed from wrought iron to chain link. The cars parked on the street changed from German imports to domestic beaters. I was returning to my sector. The windshield wipers slapped back and forth, slap thud, slap thud. I thought about the compass sitting on the table at home. Leo didn't need a compass tonight. A compass only works if you want to find true north. Leo had spent his life trying to find a shortcut, a magnetic anomaly that would let him bypass the map. Tonight, he was going to learn that the map is the territory. You can't leverage gravity. You can't disrupt the fall. I turned onto my street. The brick bungalows were dark, sleeping the sleep of the honest and the solvent. I pulled into the alley behind my house. The garage door opened with a groan of rusted springs. I pulled the Buick inside, the engine heat ticking in the cold air. I killed the ignition.
The silence returned instantly. It was heavier than before. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the presence of knowledge. I sat in the dark car for a long time, listening to the wind rattle the loose pane in the garage window. I had left my post. The watchman had walked away. I opened the car door and stepped out onto the concrete. My legs felt old. It was done. The raid was likely happening right now. The door was splintering. The glass was shattering. The illusion was ending. I walked toward the back door of the house. I didn't look back at the car. I needed a drink, and I needed to wait for the news.
The furnace kicked on with a low, rhythmic shudder, pumping warm air through the vents of the bungalow. The thermostat read 72 degrees. I was freezing. I sat in my armchair, still wearing my flannel shirt. The greatcoat hung back in the closet like a shed skin. The chill wasn't atmospheric, it was internal. It was the temperature of shock, the kind that settles in the marrow when the adrenaline dump ends and the reality begins to metabolize. I reached for the bottle on the side table. It was a single malt I kept for wakes and bad diagnoses. I didn't bother with ice. Ice dilutes the truth. I poured 2 fingers into a heavy crystal tumbler, one of the few nice things Elena had insisted we keep. The liquid was dark amber, swirling in the glass like molten copper. I picked up the remote and pressed the power button. The television flickered to life. The room was suddenly filled with the jarring, manic energy of a rebroadcast holiday parade. High school marching bands and shakos, floats covered in papier-mâché, hosts with blinding teeth pretending to be warm in the New York chill. I watched it without seeing it. I was waiting for the interruption. It took 20 minutes. I watched a giant inflatable cartoon character navigate a turn on the screen. Then the screen froze. The audio dipped. The cheerful brass band music was replaced by a sharp, urgent electronic stinger.
Breaking news. The banner slashed across the bottom of the screen in urgent crimson. We interrupt this program for a developing story in the Ridgewood Heights district, the anchor said. Her voice was serious, practiced, pitching the drama just right. The image cut to an aerial shot, a news chopper hovering in the storm. The camera zoomed in. The snow was a chaotic white static interfering with the lens, but the subject was unmistakable. The glass castle. From the air, it looked even more fragile. It was a glowing splinter of light surrounded by darkness, but the golden glow of the party was gone, drowned out by a kaleidoscope of strobe lights, red and blue, dozens of them. They washed over the snow, over the Ferraris, over the pristine white roof, turning the Christmas decorations into a crime scene pulsing with emergency frequencies. Federal agents have executed a raid on the home of a prominent local financier, the anchor narrated. Sources tell us this is part of a multi-state crackdown on securities fraud involving Argo's capital. I didn't blink. I took a sip of the scotch. It didn't taste like peat or smoke. It tasted like inevitability.
The camera cut to the ground level, a shaky, handheld shot from behind the police line. The front door, that massive pivot-hinge slab, was wide open. They started bringing them out. First came the support staff, the junior analysts, the hangers-on. They looked confused, shielding their faces with their hands, scurrying toward the transport vans like cockroaches caught in the kitchen light. Then, the main event. 2 agents in windbreakers with FBI in bold yellow letters on the back walked a man out. It was the silver-haired man. I watched him closely. He wasn't hiding his face. He wasn't struggling. He walked with a casual, bored stroll, as if he were being escorted to a VIP lounge rather than a federal holding cell. His wrists were cuffed behind his back, but his posture remained impeccable. He looked annoyed, perhaps slightly inconvenienced, but not afraid. He was already calculating the bail, the plea deal, the assets he had stashed in non-extradition zones. He was a professional. He treated the handcuffs like a bracelet he hadn't chosen, but could afford to replace. Then, a gap. The agents waited, and then they brought out Leo.
The glass trembled in my hand. He didn't look like a titan. He didn't look like a disruptor. He looked like a child who had been woken up by a fire. His Italian suit jacket was torn at the shoulder. He must have struggled or fallen. His tie was undone, hanging like a noose around his neck. The snow was already soaking into his dress shirt, turning it transparent against his skin. He wasn't walking. He was being carried, his legs stumbling, his feet dragging in the snow he had been too good to shovel. He was weeping. It wasn't a stoic, silent cry. Even through the television I could see the heaving of his chest, the open-mouthed, gasping sobs of a man whose reality has just shattered into a million cutting shards. His face was a mask of snot and tears and terror. The camera light hit him. He flinched, blindingly bright. And then he looked right at the lens. He stopped. The agents tugged at him, but he planted his feet for a second. He stared into the camera, his eyes wide, frantic, searching the void. He wasn't looking at the audience. He was looking for me. He was looking for the old wolf. He was looking for the man who fixes the fenders, who pays the fines, who makes the bad things go away. He was sending a desperate frequency through the fiber optics, a plea for salvation.
"Dad, help!" I stared back at his pixelated face. "I can't," I whispered to the empty room. "Not this time." The agents shoved him forward. He stumbled, disappearing into the back of the black sedan I had seen earlier. The door slammed shut, the lock engaged. The camera panned back to the house, to the empty champagne glasses visible through the window. I lifted the tumbler to my lips. I downed the rest of the scotch in one swallow. It burned going down, a clean, cauterizing fire. It burned the throat, but it didn't touch the cold in my stomach. The parade footage resumed. A marching band from Ohio started playing Jingle Bells. I set the glass down on the coaster. The ring of crystal on wood was the final period at the end of the sentence. I sat there, watching the happy children march, while my son rode in the dark toward a cage I couldn't unlock.
The television screen was black, a rectangular void that still held a faint, static charge from the broadcast. The image of my son weeping in the snow was gone, replaced by the reflection of the empty room. I sat in the dark. The only light came from the fireplace, where the logs I had stacked 3 hours ago were losing their battle against the chemistry of combustion. They were no longer wood. They were skeletons of carbon, glowing with a pulsing, deep red heat that was slowly fading into gray. The silence in the house was absolute. It was the heavy, insulated silence of a bunker after the bombardment has ceased. I could hear the wind buffeting the chimney, a low moan that sounded like the house itself was grieving. Then, the phone rang. It was the landline, a heavy, beige unit on the side table that I kept for emergencies and telemarketers. It didn't chirp. It didn't buzz. It rang with the mechanical, jarring trill of a physical bell being struck by a metal hammer. The sound sliced through the quiet like a razor through canvas. I didn't jump. My heart rate didn't spike. I sat perfectly still, my hand resting on the arm of the chair, the empty scotch glass cooling against my palm. I stared at the receiver. It was a plastic shell, but in that moment, it felt radioactive. I knew who it was. The list of probabilities was short, and every variable led to the same conclusion: desperation. It could be Leo.
I closed my eyes, and the image constructed itself. He would be at the intake desk at the Federal Building downtown. They would have stripped him of his belt, his shoelaces, and that ridiculous watch. He would be standing in his socks on the cold linoleum, shivering, holding a receiver with a frayed cord. He would be using his one call. He wouldn't call his wife. He wouldn't call the silver-haired man. He would call the fixer. He would call the old wolf. He would expect to hear my voice, gruff, steady, irritated, telling him to sit tight, telling him I was on my way, telling him that I had a guy who knew a judge. He wanted the father who paid the tuition. He wanted the father who hid the dented bumper. He wanted the safety net. Ring. It could be his wife, Amanda. She would be hysterical, but not for him. She would be calling from the glass castle, watching the agents box up her jewelry and tag the furniture. She would be screaming about the accounts, about the frozen assets, asking me if I had any cash buried in the backyard. She would want to know if the pension was safe, if I could cover the retainer for the defense team. She would be looking for a new host to attach to, now that the old one was withering. Ring. It could be a lawyer. A shark smelling blood in the water, looking for a retainer I no longer had the heart or the stomach to provide. They would use words like mitigation and cooperation strategy, translating my son's life into billable hours.
I watched the phone. The red light on the base flashed in sync with the ring, a distress beacon. My hand twitched. It was muscle memory, etched deep into the nervous system. Answer the call, solve the problem, protect the pack. If I picked up that receiver, I could stop the noise. I could say, I'm here. I could drive down there. I could mortgage the bungalow. I could drain the retirement accounts. I could hire the best sharks in the city. I could probably get him out on bail by morning. I could bring him home. I could make him soup. I could let him sleep in his old room. And in 6 months, when the fear wore off, he would do it again, because he would know that the net was still there. He would know that the old wolf was still on patrol, ready to eat his enemies and bury his mistakes. He would never learn to hunt. He would never learn to fear the winter. He would remain a child, dressed in a man's suit, waiting for daddy to fix the world. Ring. The sound was unrelenting. It echoed off the hardwood floors, bouncing into the empty kitchen, the empty hall, the empty nursery that was now a guest room. I looked at the fire. A log shifted, collapsing into a heap of sparks that swirled up the chimney. The red glow was dimming. The ash was taking over, a creeping gray blanket suffocating the heat.
Everything burns eventually. The trick is knowing when to stop adding fuel. I had spent 40 years adding fuel to Leo's life. I had shielded him from the wind. I had kept him warm. And in doing so, I had denied him the one thing that makes a man strong, the cold. I thought about the compass on the table. It pointed north, always north. It didn't care about your feelings. It didn't care if you were lost. It just told you the truth. The truth was that Leo was a criminal. He was a thief who stole from pension funds and teachers' unions to buy Ferraris and admiration. He had made his choices. He had built his glass castle. Now he had to live in the ruins. The ring dragged on, longer than usual. The system at the jail cuts the connection after a set time if there is no answer. We were reaching the limit. I imagined him there, pressing the phone to his ear, listening to the hollow, rhythmic purr of the line ringing in the house he grew up in. I imagined the panic rising in his chest as the realization hit him. He's not coming. For the first time in his life, the cavalry was not cresting the hill.
The guilt was a physical weight, pressing on my chest, making it hard to draw breath. It tasted of bile and copper. It felt like betraying a biological imperative. A father protects, that is the law. But a watchman protects the perimeter, and sometimes the threat is inside the walls. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the dying fire and the stale scotch. I love you, son, I whispered. My voice was a rasp, broken and old. That's why I'm letting you fall. Ring, ring. Silence. The phone stopped. The connection was severed. The red light on the base station went dark. The silence that rushed back into the room was deafening. It was heavier than before. It was final. The line was dead. The message had been delivered. I sat there for a long time, watching the last ember pulse and die. The room turned gray. The cold began to creep in from the corners, seeping through the brick, claiming the space. I was shivering. I was old. I was alone. But I was resolved. I placed the crystal glass on the coaster. I stood up, my knees cracking in the quiet. I walked to the lamp on the side table, the one next to the silent phone. I reached out and found the switch. "Merry Christmas, Mio," I said. I turned the switch. The room went black. The watchman had left his post.